But I am delighted to be introducing Susan Neuman. She's a professor and chair of teaching and learning at NYU in New York City, not the Bronx, specializing in education and early childhood policy. Previously, she was a professor at the University of Michigan, where interestingly, she and Carol Connor both worked together. She served as U.S. Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education under George Bush. And in her role as Assistant Secretary, she established government policies that were targeted to improving the lives of people who live in poverty. She has served as advisor on national and international boards and has conducted many evaluations to better understand how community resources can be used to enable families to prosper in often difficult circumstances. Dr. Neuman has authored 11 books that focus on education, you're a busy lady, and educational policies, among them Changing the Odds for Children at Risk and Giving Children a Fighting Chance. I am thrilled to be bringing Susan Neuman to share wisdom and excitement with you today. Thank you.
It's true. You know, I sometimes say that New Yorkers are very provincial. We are. Right. We think we're the greatest in the world, but we are at heart. So I've never been to Yonkers. I didn't even know where it was. I hate to say that. And yet I live in Manhattan. So Johanna, nice to see you. I'm delighted to see you and be here today. So I went Metro North for the first time. And I was very offended because they asked me if I wanted a senior ticket. So, not good. All right, so one of the things I wanted to talk about today is something that we're very involved in, both we started it in Michigan, but actually we've been in New York, working in 4 boroughs last year. This coming year, we're working in particular in South Bronx. And I want to talk about some of the issues as well as some of the interventions that we're involved in. So I'll start by giving you an overview of what I wanted to talk about. Specifically, I want to talk about vocabulary instruction because it's something that is very passionate, very important to me. One of the things that I think is something that we need to talk about is the importance of oral language vocabulary, focusing on oral language before we move to print language. I want to talk about some of the key principles of effective instruction and some strategies to improve. So what we're going to do today, by the way, this is a book that if you're interested in the topic, it's all about words on Teachers College Press. So we're going to begin today with an interesting exercise. What I want you to do is, you've been quiet for too long. Teachers and educators are never quiet. So I want to do this experiment. I want you to hang out with someone next to you. If there are 3 of you, just clustered together. And you have 1 minute, and believe me, I'm going to time you. You have 1 minute to teach something to your peer. Then after that 1 minute, I'm going to call it, and then you have 1 minute for your peer to teach to you, okay? Do you have the instructions? You know what you have to do? You sure? Wait, you can't get going? You can't get going?
Well, I taught, what's your name?
Mary.
Mary, about the organic approach to reading, which is a program that we use in our preschool.
Okay, all right. You talked about the organic
Approach to reading, or the organic approach to reading for preschoolers.
Okay, all right, great. What else did someone teach? Yes?
I taught Colleen how to send an email on her iPhone. 45 seconds.
And how did you teach it?
I modeled it with her. I had my own iPhone.
So you showed her how?
Yes.
Okay. What did you teach?
I taught Jay how to add a person to his call.
how to add a person to,
You're speaking to somebody and then you add somebody to them.
how'd you do it?
You show them in the phone.
You showed them on the phone, okay. Anybody else? One more, just one more.
I was a lightweight. I taught them how to do a sound effect.
How'd you do it? And did you respond in kind, I hope? No. So my point in trying to show you that and to talk about that for a second is you did exactly what we typically do when we teach something to children. Most of you, given the fact that I gave you very little time, you had to model it, right? So a number of you said, I modeled and I demonstrated something. And that was relatively easy to do. But also, notice that you had to be explicit. So when you talked about the organic approach to reading, you had to be very explicit about what you were teaching. And you had to do that because I didn't give you any time, did I? I gave you only 1 minute and you were in a hurry. And then you had to be rather systematic in what you were trying to say. You had to tell it, you had to get it out, and you had to ensure that the student, that whoever was listening was learning. So my point is, these are key strategies for teaching. And one of the things that we've got to realize is that you and I don't have time. All of our children need instruction that involves modeling and demonstrating, explicit and systematic instruction. So one of the things, I'm sure many of you know this study by now. It's been talked about in the media a great deal. It's by Hart and Risley. They focused on the issue of the word gap and the fact that many of our children who begin even at 9 months have very different experiences in their homes. Some of the children are being talked to, negotiated with all the time. Other children have limited language opportunities. There's a lot of punitives, a lot of directives in the kind of conversation they're getting at the home. But these have ramifications over time. And one of the things we found is children, when they're as early as 2 years old, if they keep asking questions of their parents or their caregivers, and the parents or caregivers don't give answers, they stop asking questions over time. They learn that their questions and their comments are not responded to. And one of the things that we have got to realize is we have to begin early. These kinds of modeling experiences are so critically important to our young children. So one of the risk factors you and I all know we're involved in. We're in the greatest city, in the greatest area in the country, in the world. But at the same time, we know there are common risk factors that all of us have seen. Children of poor, marginalized populations, children of families who speak a language other than English, and mother's education all predict risk factors. Those children are likely to come to school having difficulties or being behind, not because they're not capable, but because our environmental constraints are so difficult. The biggest constraint, you and I know, is poverty. Poverty has legs. I always describe it as something. I had a wonderful girlfriend who was in her 40s. And whenever I saw her at a conference, she was wearing gorgeous shoes. Gorgeous shoes. And I used to say, why, Leah, are you wearing these beautiful shoes? I've never seen anything so glorious. And she said, when I grew up, I could hardly afford shoes. And so now, every time I look at those shoes, I know I've left poverty. I am middle class and I'm able to buy these shoes in a way. And so poverty has this legacy that's very hard for young children to overcome. So one of the things we see, and I always say to some extent this is good news, is the National Assessment of Educational Progress shows that if you're poor, if you come from marginalized populations, you are likely to be below basic or at basic levels. This is nothing that surprises any of you, does it? But inherent in this graph is actually good news. And I want to emphasize that today. because what it's suggesting is that our children are wonderful. It's the environment that is affecting their achievement. And so when you and I change that environment, we change this graph. We change that opportunity so that children are able to be successful. And I want to show you in ways which we're doing that. One of the things we know, as I mentioned early on, is that vocabulary is the highest predictor of children's success. Not only in elementary, but in high school. It also predicts who will actually graduate and end up going to college. But the number of words children need to know is extraordinary. You probably can't guess. The numbers are probably larger than you can imagine. By the time children leave high school, how many words do we assume they need to know? Want to take a guess? Well, Don Hirsch has suggested that they need 80,000. Now, this is an interesting problem for all of us as teachers. Because you and I, how can we teach 80,000 words to children? Do you see the essential problem? So you and I have to develop self-teaching strategies for these children. We've got to help them learn how to learn on their own. So here are some of the challenges that we find in teaching vocabulary. First, what words do we teach? Some people suggest tier 2 or challenging words, sophisticated words. Others, I'm going to tell you that we use tier 3, content-rich words. How many words to teach at one time? How should we cluster those words in terms of instruction? How do we assess whether children are learning or not? But the big question I want to continually raise is we cannot just improve children's instruction. We've got to accelerate it. Accelerate it, meaning we have to jumpstart it. So, here's the problem. Carol was bringing up another problem, but we don't have time for you to read this. But if you look very quickly, look at some of the words that might be difficult for children to read. This is a grade 6 text. It's from the Common Core. Take just a second. What words do you think are going to be difficult?
Unpiloted.
Say it again.
Instruction,
Instruction.
because of the 3 syllables.
Okay, good point. Another. What? Yes.
Asteroid.
Asteroids, comets.
Even leaves if they don't know. On board. On board.
Exactly. So if we look at the difficult words the children need and will have difficulty, and I can tell you I'm not into science that much, so I can't give you a good definition of what an asteroid is. But asteroid, comet, atmospheric conditions, space probes, these are all difficult words, right? What do they have in common?
Science. Faith.
They're content-rich words. Oh, sorry. They're content-rich words. They are not tier 2 sophisticated words. They are tier 3 or content-rich words. They are the words that children will need to know in order to be successful and read grade-level texts by the time they're at grade 3 and above. So one of our problems is that every single program, Carol mentioned a couple of program scope and sequence of different programs, but here's one of our problems. You and I live in a very mobile environment. A lot of our children come to one school, they leave school. We have a lot of transferability. And what we've seen is when children transfer from one school to another, they're likely to get a different book and a different curriculum and a whole different scope and sequence. And the children who need help the most are the likely to get the most confused. And so one of the things that we've seen is, this is just an example of the different kind of curriculum from 4 different series they're likely to have. So what are some of the key principles of effective vocabulary instruction? And I know we have limited time. First, we need to help children become word conscious, to really love words. to see an opportunity to learn words. So I'll use, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. And you know what kids will say when I do that? They'll perk up because I'm getting them to be sensitive to words. They will need frequency of encounters. They will need to see those words a lot. So we found in our studies that sometimes they need to see the word 28 separate times before they actually learn the word. I'm not suggesting that's a rigid rule, but I'm suggesting that we under-recognize the importance of frequency of interaction. Finally, words need to be connected to developing knowledge networks. So I want to show you how we're going to do that. We use an instructional regime. I was interested, and Carol used that term. It's actually from Steve Roundbush. But here's our strategy for teaching words. We first identify the words. We give meaning in terms of exemplars. We give them lots of other practice, but practice in different contexts. We review, and we do something called distributed review, where we'll review immediately, review over 2 weeks, review over 4 weeks. And then finally, we always monitor children's progress along the way. So let me show you a little bit what it looks like. First, we always begin with explicit instruction. We find that teachers do this too often. They'll look at a book and they'll say to the children, "What's this? What's this?" They ask too many questions, too many questions. Rather, children need to be said, "This is a story about caves. It's about a hole in a mountain." In other words, I'm giving them an explicit definition of that word that really helps them understand. We use a lot of multimedia. Michael Coyne, my colleagues, use something called magic words. Like when I read a book, every time you hear the word gigantic, raise your hand as our magic word for the day. Rebecca Silverman uses multi-dimensional instruction where she has kids draw and write and talk. And Beck McCowan uses rich description and definition and words in context. But the interesting phenomena is that if you only do explicit instruction, you will have lost our way, because it turns out that, let me see, I want to do that in a second. I'm going to come back to that actually. It turns out that explicit and implicit instruction is actually best. So in other words, what we do is we begin with explicit instruction, giving children definitions of words, but then we engage children in activities that use the words in context. And that is the most powerful strategy that we can do. We do it through, let me see, now I'm going to go backwards. We do it through something that I think is very important. Typically, teachers will put up a read aloud text and they'll pick out the words that are difficult for the children to learn, right? So in other words, they'll pick out platypuses. It's a book about platypus. And so let me use that as a word. But you and I know we don't see many platypuses around the corner, right? It's not like a word that the kids absolutely have to have. Around. Most kids know what the word around is. Not particularly meaningful. So one of the things that we've done in teaching vocabulary is we focus on this strategy, where we're teaching words that are related to one another. Now this is a very simple strategy, but it builds knowledge networks. So in other words, if I teach children about insects, antennae, segments, and legs, and I say to them, they're all related to insects. Children begin to develop a knowledge network of what an insect is or is not. When I teach parts of the body, I'm going to teach brain, heart, lungs. I'm going to teach all the words that are related to that particular topic. So what we're doing is we're building the words that are related to knowledge networks. We also do fun things. Remember Sesame Street years ago, and they used to say which one doesn't belong? Remember that? You and I, come on. Yeah. But which one doesn't belong is a strategy to build categories. We do time for a challenge. So we say to children, is a snake a pet or a wild animal? And the children will say, it's a wild animal because a snake can bite. But then another child might say, it's not a wild animal, it's a pet. I have a garter snake at home and I just feed it, etc. My point is, it's not a matter of whether or not one is right or wrong. It's the justification that children are developing that matters. Words and picture sorts are also important. And so we do very simple strategy. Remember, I start with pre-K, I go all the way to grade 3. But one of the strategies is we say, how are things alike? And tell me what is the category that children can build. And what we find is we do this in a very simple strategy. And now we've been in 4 boroughs and we have tremendous effects, not only for our poor kids, but also for our ELL kids in particular. So our Ls have particularly benefited from this strategy. Here's what we do real quickly, because I only have a few minutes. We develop what we call text sets, which are books of different genres. So in our belief, I love Common Core for many reasons, but I also know that it's too hard for our young children who are just beginning. So what we do is we develop text sets that engage children in different genres, helping them stair-step to information text. So we'll have collections of books that focus on a particular concept or topic that's really interesting. So one of the things that we did this year is on mysteries of space or extreme weather. And we'll put regular wonderful children's literature books in these text sets of 5 text sets each. What we'll do is the text sets look like this. One book is predictable, one is a rhyming, one is a narrative nonfiction, and one's an informational. And what we'll do is, you know that predictable text is great because if I said to you, that's Sam I am, that's Sam I am.
Dr. Seuss, green eggs and ham.
All right, come on, guys, this is a better. That's Sam I am, that's Sam I am. I do not like green eggs and ham. I need some preschool teachers. But my point is, some of us remember those lines. Conjunction, junction.
What's your function?
Why do you remember that? Because it was done in a predictable way. And a predictable way is a form of developing a mnemonic. In other words, you remember it. So what we do is we introduce words through predictable text. We'll then use rhyming text. By the time they get to the information book, which is at the end of day 5, they now know the words because they've seen them repeatedly. Remember, the frequency issue really matters. They'll see them in predictable, rhyming, narrative, nonfiction. These words are next to, absolutely central to these children. We also progress monitor all the time. So we'll take a group of kids and we'll say, which one is an insect? Tell us why. Which one has 3 body parts? So we'll do a lot of informal progress monitoring. We never write it down. What we're interested in is learning more about our own instruction. We do what we call eye-to-eye instruction. We ask teachers to stop, drop the phone, drop anything related to mealtime or whatever, and pay attention to those children. And look at the children when she's reading to them. Notice that she's gotten off her rocking chair. That's a big deal. She's down with the children, looking at them, engaging them, and showing attention. We also, I know everybody's been told that open-ended responses are really important, but open-ended responses occur too early on in children's development. They first need to do some choral reading, some close-ended responses so we know that they know the information, and then finally open-ended responses. So it's a gradual release of control rather than an immediate release of control. And then, this is real briefly, I'm just about done. Daily readings of these text sets. We start with the predictable, we move on to narrative nonfiction, and then we turn to information books. They will have all the components necessary for Common Core grade level. All of these are highly aligned to Common Core. So what is our evidence? Pretty darn good. What we've seen, we have a trial that has 1,960 children in 4 boroughs in New York City. And what we're seeing is we had this very interesting experience where we had treatment control group, this is the bottom. The 2 top are middle-class children, upper middle-class children from a local area. And what do we find? We find that our poor kids are exceeding the control way off. They're exceeding the middle-class children, and they're at par with the high-income children. So it is possible to do, and it is possible to do in a year. Here's my contact information. Thanks so much.